Hello and welcome. This is the Black Ponderer. I am the host, Neil Trotter. Thanks for tuning in. This is a philosophy channel. We talk about philosophical texts. Primarily, that's what we do. We do other things too, but that's mostly what we do, right? We talk about philosophical texts, and we're going to get back to the fundamentals. We're going to get back to where it all started. We're going back to ancient Greek philosophy in terms of like what I used to do here on the channel, where the basics. This is the classic Gorgias by Plato. And this is one of Plato's dialogues, great place to start, because I often get asked a question, where should I start if I want to study philosophy, but I've never done it before. Plato's dialogues is a great place to start, and that's many philosophers or people who are into philosophy would recommend that, and I'd recommend it too. Now, what I want to get into is what it's called Plato's dialogues, right? So dialogue, right? The concept of dialogue, right? As opposed to philosophers or people writing down long prose or long nonfiction where they're kind of talking at you, but they're not talking between other people, right? And Plato was all about he wanted to convey ideas through conversation, through a dialectic, right? Which is a word that's tossed in philosophy often, dialectics. And what is dialectics? Well, it means certain things depending on the context and which philosopher you're referring to. But I think in general, it's a way of approaching philosophy in which you're exchanging ideas with somebody, and then that somebody bounces ideas back off to you, and a lot of times it's disagreement, and there's this productive, constructive feedback loop where you grow. You grow as a person, and you also grow the field of philosophy. You make each other's arguments stronger, and you're not stuck in camps, right? You're open to grow, and that's an important way of thinking about philosophy. And I think that's one of the cool things about Plato, right? Is that he stuck to this form of dialogue to convey his ideas, and we're going to be talking about that today, and that's going to be very interesting. So dialogue as a way of philosophy, right? And I'll just start reading some quotes here. In the Black Ponderer, we read quotes from the text, right? That's what we do. And then I just add my commentary to that, and then we continue the conversation below in the comment section. So feel free to do so, or you can just listen, and be the lurker. That's fine too, or just, watcher. But I'm going to start with the introduction, right? From the person who translated this edition. This is the Penguin Black Classics edition, which I love Penguin Black Classics. Not everybody is a fan, but I think it's pretty cool. I like the Black Classics because they have these really intense, really thorough introductions, which I know a lot of people aren't fond of introductions, right? They particularly long ones, and this one has Black Classics usually have long introductions, but to me it's kind of like, well, it's like taking a class, it's like you're having a philosopher kind of lecture to you, and I just talked about dialogues are important. But the introduction gives you a lot of context, and you might not necessarily agree with what the person's saying in the introduction, but it is providing you context, so you're not just diving in head first and without any background information. Which I know that some people like that. They're like, I just want to dive head in and just read, with no context whatsoever. But I think it's important to have context. And Penguin Black Classics editions, they offer a lot of context, even in between the work. They'll add supplementary commentary in between the work, which I like. I like that style. I think a lot of people aren't a fan of that. But I like that about the Penguin Classics edition. But so I'm going to read this little snippet from the introduction. It's on page 20 or XX Roman numeral, because it's not the actual work. We will read the actual work, but let me premise it right here. So, and this is the second paragraph. It starts on the first line here. Why did Plato write dialogues? Right, skip down for 3 lines here. One possible answer to the question lies in Plato's adoption of the method of his teacher, Socrates, right, who appears to have believed that real progress in philosophy is made by mutual discussion of issues of importance by 2 or more individuals, rather than through solitary monologue. So I underlined that. Real progress in philosophy is made by mutual discussion. Oops. Now, do we live in that world today? No, right? It's people talking at each other. It's people talking past each other. It's a lot of argumentation that's like kind of petty and cruel. But it's not a lot. It's not, the mutual discussion isn't there, right? And that's sad, right? And that's why oftentimes on the internet, particularly you see philosophy kind of dead in the water. Not all of it. Like, there's a lot of great philosophy on the internet, but there's a lot of philosophy is kind of dead in the water, which is because there's no mutual discussion. It's just kind of people talking at you, not with each other, you know, in mutual motivation to progress the field of philosophy. One of the reasons why I started the channel was to promote that. But let me continue here. I skipped down 4 lines. It allows individuals under questioning and in interaction with others to examine their own values and assumptions. Very important, right? Examining your own values and assumptions. So you have an idea, a philosophical idea. Okay, now you have to take a moment, probably, you know, longer than a moment, to examine your idea. You gotta be like, okay, is this actually something I should be pushing to people? Or like, what is the validity and strength of this, right? And a great way to do that is to talk to people you disagree with in a mutual discussion. The pressure of defending beliefs also reveals individual psychology. The emotional and temperamental aspect of personality is for Plato quite as important as the intellectual. In Plato's dialogues, people feel ashamed. They needle, insult and tease each other, lose their tempers, joke and express strong feelings of friendship or animosity, as well as engaging in serious intellectual discussion. And so it's par for the course, right? And that's, you know, so it's not just about like staying even keel all the time, you know, being all stoic in the stoic with a lowercase s, not, you know, the Webster's dictionary stoic of just, you know, being emotionless and being like this stature of like, well, my premise is this and I believe this, and okay, that's your point of view. It's like, no, like people are gonna pop off and people are gonna become very emotional, and you know, maybe some insults will be thrown, because we're, you know, in philosophy you're talking about really deep core life and death issues, you know, very emotional issues, you know, issues regarding like what life means. So, you know, it's gonna get deep, you know, and you shouldn't be afraid of that. But the emotions and the psychology that raises up communicates the important aspects of the philosophy. So you avoid those kinds of emotional, psychological undertakings when you talk about these deep concepts. But, you know, it should all be in the service of mutual understanding, mutual communication, and hopefully like progress in like the construction of new and better ideas, right? Rather than just tearing somebody down just because, right, you disagree with somebody, so I'm just gonna tear you down, right? No, Plato's dialogues aren't about that. They're about mutual discussion, but they don't shy away from the emotional, psychological aspects. And I will skip down. We're still in the introduction. This is Roman numeral page 31, XXXI. This is the second line. Plato's Socrates, however, continually insists that his purpose is not to win the argument. Okay? Important. The practice of dispute associated with the sophists, but to discover the truth by means of cooperative discussion, you know, cooperative discussion, not competitive discussion, cooperative discussion with the interlocutor through dialectic. Through dialectic, okay? We're using these key terms here. It is only by this form of face-to-face discussion, you know, online discussion is cool, but the Twitter debates, or I guess X debates, right, and all this microblogging, flame wars, that's really not so much face-to-face discussion, right? You need to sit down in front of the person and have kind of long-form discussions, right? This is how we actually do meaningful philosophy. So he says, the writer of this introduction, it is only by this form of face-to-face discussion that the truth will emerge. It's true. So with that said, let's go into some of the ideas that Gorgias brings up, right, in this dialogue that Plato wrote. And we're actually going to read the dialogue itself right now. If you're a regular here on the Black Ponderer, you already know the drill. I don't do book reports. I don't do like summaries of the entire book, and if you're new here, there you have it. This isn't like Sparks Notes, or like I'm not trying to provide an abstract that describes the whole book. We're just talk about ideas that are presented in the work, and we kind of hone in on those ideas and we think about them philosophically, right? So we use text more as a jumping off point to discuss philosophical concepts. And what better jumping off point than classic philosophical text? So in the dialogue, Plato brings up this concept of oratory, right? Oratory, and what is that? And it talks about persuasive oratory, or persuasion, right? So, and it's fascinating to think about these things. I'll just read what I highlighted here. I'm going to go through a significant amount of the dialogue, but it's fine. We'll interject here and there. This is page 16 of this Penguin Classic edition. And so I'm going to start off with Socrates. He's saying, well, do you think that knowing and believing are the same? Or is there a difference between knowledge and belief? Right? And Gorgias says, I should say that there is a difference. Socrates is quite right. And you can prove it like this. If you were asked if there is true and false belief, you would say that there is no doubt. Yes, Gorgias replies. Socrates, well then, is there true and false knowledge? Gorgias is certainly not. Socrates says, and then knowledge and belief are clearly not the same thing. True, Gorgias reply. And then Socrates says, yet those who have been persuaded into believing something may just as properly be called convinced as those who have learned it. Question mark. So that was a question. Gorgias is like, yes. Socrates, may we then establish that there are two kinds of conviction? So there's two kinds of conviction. One which gives knowledge and one which gives belief without knowledge? Certainly. Okay. So Socrates says, now which kind of conviction does oratory produce about right and wrong in courts of law and with other large masses? The kind which engenders knowledge, or the kind which engenders belief without knowledge? And Gorgias replies, the kind which engenders belief, obviously. Socrates, oratory then, as it seems, produces conviction about right and wrong, which is a matter of persuasion and belief, not the result of teaching and learning. Gorgias is yes. Socrates, and the orator does not teach juries and other large masses about right and wrong. He merely persuades them. He could hardly teach so large a mass of people matters of such importance in a short time, right? So, and then I put in my little notes on the margins here. Oratory is about persuasion, not facts and truth. So Socrates is making a great point here, which is, I think, important to highlight, which they acknowledged here back in ancient Greece. Right? This dialogue, the Gorgias, is written in around 380 BC. Okay, so today people will say like, oh, we live in a post-facts society where facts don't really matter. People are convinced by persuasion, or charisma, or they're compelled by emotion rather than facts or truth, right? And then Socrates goes further and talks about how people are not even persuaded by morality. But when Socrates brings up morality equals truth. So it's like the same thing. Like, what's true is what's moral. What's true is what's ethical. And he's bringing up the fact that, hey, you don't have to be true, or you don't have to be factual to persuade the masses, right? I mean, that happens in the jury all the time, right? And I think that's a hell of a point. Obviously, that's the thing today. Like, people are persuaded by all types of things, not based off of facts. It's just the person who's the most persuasive is the one that people tend to follow. Oftentimes, facts, evidence, even morality hurts one's ability to persuade the masses, or at least it has very little to do with persuasion. So what Socrates is getting at is oratory is not really based in morality. Or, and I would further say, like, it's not based off of facts and truth, right? And it's interesting because not only does that follow in today's world, I would argue. Just look at politics, today's politics, to see that. But the other thing is that Socrates is building on, he uses this as the foundation, then he makes a point that follows this, which is interesting. And here, this is page 18. This is Gorgias. He's like, yeah, Socrates, you bring up a good point. And here's his long monologue. You might well be amazed, Socrates, if you knew the whole truth and realized that oratory embraces and controls almost all other spheres of human activity. I can give you a striking proof of this. It has often happened that I have gone with my brother and other doctors to visit some sick person who refused to drink his medicine or to submit to surgery or cautery, and when the doctors could not persuade him, I have succeeded simply by my use of the art of oratory. And we definitely are seeing that kind of stuff today, right? Where people are like, medical science based off of hard evidence is rejected by people. Take, for example, vaccines, right? But then Gorgias says, like, hey, I can persuade these people to do it if I, because of my skill at persuasion through oratory. I tell you that if in any city you care to name, an orator and a doctor had to compete before the assembly, or in any other gathering for the appointment of a medical officer, the man who could speak would be appointed if he wanted the post, and the doctor would end up nowhere. Right? I mean, damn, like, did COVID-19 not show that? Because it definitely did. I'm not wearing a mask. Why? It's been proven that masks prevents the spread of the disease. Well, it's cowardly to do that, and the government's controlling you, and it's like, but that has not. What basis does that? Well, just that that's how I feel because somebody told me that. And that's just one example. We can go on about other kinds of examples, which Gorgias does. Similarly, if he had to compete with any other professional worker, the orator could get himself appointed against any opposition. There's no subject on which he could not speak before a popular audience more persuasively than any professional or whatever kind. Such is the nature and power of the art of oratory, Socrates, but it should be used as with any other competitive skill. Just because a man has acquired such skills in boxing or all in wrestling or armed combat that he can beat anyone, friend or foe, that is no reason why he should employ it against all men indiscriminately and strike and wound and kill his friends. That's a pretty important point. He's admitting, like, hey, I can tell people to do all types of stuff that could be very dangerous to them, because that's just, if you're really good at speaking with people and persuasion, you can get people to do all types of things that's not based off of fact or morality, for that matter. But you need to be very careful, and with power comes great responsibility, kind of thing. So Gorgias, he acknowledges, like, okay, there's some problems here, but that's just a skill some people have, and it's not necessarily a problem with the skill. More so, the issue is the self-control, and the people who are skilled at doing that need to keep themselves in check, or use that power for the right reason rather than the wrong reason, right? But then he continues, not yet by Zeus, if of course at the training school has put a man in a good condition and made him a boxer, and he then strikes his father or mother or some relation or friend. That is no reason for detesting and banishing trainers and those who teach the use of weapons, for they passed on those skills intending that they should be put to a good use against the country's enemies and against wrongdoers, defensively, not aggressively. And if their pupils, on the contrary, made bad use of their strength and skill, it does not follow that teachers are criminal, or the art which they teach culpable and wicked. The fault rests with those who do not make a proper use of it. The same holds good about oratory. The orator is able to speak on any subject against any opposition so as to be more persuasive in front of the masses. In short, on any topic he chooses. But the fact that he possesses the power to deprive doctors and other professionals of their reputation does not justify him in doing so. That's very important, right? So we're admitting, like, hey, people can do that kind of stuff, but people shouldn't. Like, I mean, that's not, you should, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. And we got a lot of people that are very skilled at doing that, and they do it just because, oh, I can do it, so I'm going to. And that makes me correct. It makes me like, well, because I'm able to persuade these people against these experts, therefore I am good, or like I'm making them wrong, like because of my persuasive ability. The argument that's being stated here, and people believe this kind of thing today, right? I mean, again, just look at politics. You got powerful people saying you should do this, and it's like counter all knowledge and fact, and it's countering morality, but they're like, well, because I'm able to persuade so many people, or so I have so many followers, then there must be some validity in what I'm talking about. There must be some sort of like truth or morality in what I'm talking about, and that's not necessarily true at all, right? But these people act like that's necessarily true, and this is what Gorgias is bringing up. And let me continue with the quote. But he must use his oratory rightly, as with any other competitive skill. I think that if a man who has acquired oratorical skill then uses the power which his art confers to do wrong, that is no reason to detest his teacher. Okay, he's talking about like his teacher, or just the skill in general, right? And banish him from the city. His instruction was given to be employed for good ends, whereas the pupil is using it in the opposite way. So it is right to hate and banish and kill the one who does not use his skill rightly, but not his teacher. And I would kind of continue that line of thought with this note I put in the margin. Because oratory does not require facts to persuade, and can be a very dangerous skill. Highly skilled orators can convince people to do false things. And so Gorgias brings up like, hey, just because you've been taught to do like really these very powerful things that go counter to morality and facts doesn't mean you should imply you should do that. And it also doesn't denigrate the skill of oratory or persuasion, and it doesn't like reflect badly necessarily on the people that taught you how to do those to be as persuasive as you are. It's just you need to be in control of that. You need to take responsibility for your action. That's on you, and I think that's pretty important, and it definitely applies to today. In a culture of not only politicians but like influencers. We live in this influencer age of like, people on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, and they're like saying all these things, and this focus is like followers and likes and fan bases and subscribers, but it's like, where is the focus on like facts and like morality? Like evidence, like truth, that just goes out the window. The persuasion is all about, I just gotta get as many people following me as possible. But yeah, but what about the things that you're saying which could hurt people, right? And there is some fault to the influencer, right, who uses their power just to get people to follow them without like actually saying, okay, there's some things that are wrong here that I want to bring up, right? Which might go counter to like their persuasiveness, but is doing the right thing. And I'm just going to continue in this line of thought. I'm skipping to page 22. We've skipped a little bit, but Socrates continues. And consequently, in all matters, he will be able to get his way before a mass of people, not by teaching, but by convincing. So Socrates is like, yeah, you're saying basically what I'm trying to argue. And he's saying like, look, people can get followers not essentially by teaching, but by convincing, right? And Gorgias says, certainly. And Socrates says, you said just now that even on matters of health, the orator will be more convincing than the doctor. And Gorgias says, before a mass audience, yes, I did. And Socrates says, a mass audience means an ignorant audience, doesn't it? He wouldn't be more convincing than the doctor before experts, I presume. Gorgias, true. Socrates, now if he is more convincing than the doctor, then does he turn out to be more convincing than the expert? Naturally. Gorgias. Socrates says, not being a doctor, of course. Gorgias says, of course. Socrates, and the non-doctor presumably is ignorant of what the doctor knows. Gorgias says, obviously. So Socrates says, so when the orator is more convincing than the doctor, what happens is that an ignorant person is more convincing than the expert before an equally ignorant audience. Is this what happens? That's pretty important, because there's this idea like, well, expert opinion is the opinion that's going to rule out. That's the one that carries all the weight. An expert is going to convince people based off of their expertise. And as we know, that's not the case. It's the person that's most convincing. And how does that convincing happen? Many kinds of ways, appealing to one's emotional state, psychological state, their direct needs. And none of that necessarily has to do with like expertise, facts, truth, right? Or morality for that matter, right? So Gorgias follows, this is what happens in that case, no doubt. And then Socrates says, and the same will be true of the orator and oratory in relation to all other arts. The orator needs to have no knowledge of the truth about things. It is enough for him to have discovered a knack of persuading the ignorant that he seems to know more than the experts. He just has to have a knack for persuading. He doesn't necessarily have to have like knowledge in the thing that he's talking about. He just has to have a knack of convincing or of persuading, right? And then Socrates continues, I skipped down a little bit. We will discuss in a moment, if it turns out to be relevant, whether the orator does or does not lose to the others. But first of all, let us consider how he stands with regard to right and wrong, honor, dishonor, good and bad. So Socrates is like, okay, whether he's actually convincing people or whether he's winning debates, like that's something that we could talk about. But what I want to talk about is like, okay, is this right? Is this wrong? Like, is this ethical? Is this honorable? Like, is this good or is this bad, right? And that's the Socrates' focus. So now, I'm skipping to page 30. This is the bottom of the page here. Socrates makes this connection that I feel is very contemporary. It just applies so heavily to today's world, 2024. The year 380 BC to the year 2024 AD. Right? The same shit. The same shit. Here we go. Socrates says, oratory seems to me to be a pursuit which has nothing to do with art, but which requires a shrewd and bold spirit, naturally clever at dealing with people. The generic name which I should give it is pandering. It has many subdivisions, one of which is cookery, an occupation which masquerades as an art, but by my argument is no more than a knack acquired by routine. Well, cuisine and stuff like that is not an art. I don't know about that, but I will say, but listen to this. Under this heading, I would add oratory and beauty culture and sophistry, making 4 distinct branches corresponding to 4 distinct fields of activity. Okay, so the point here is oratory is about pandering, primarily. It's about pandering. Pandering to the audience. It's not, and that's pretty much all it's about, is what Socrates is saying. Now, is oratory really about that? No, just like cookery is not masquerading as art. If we think of cookery as like making nice cuisine, good cookery, right? But bad cookery is. For example, fast food. Right? Fast food is pandering to the public, right? It's not healthy. It just exploits people's humans' innate desire for salt and sodium, or sugar, right? It exploits that, right? And it panders to our humans' innate desire for those things. And so that kind of cookery is a kind of pandering. And there's certain kinds of oratory that also are pandering. And the thing is that these kinds of panderings, they are very effective. They're very effective. So Socrates is arguing look, a very effective oratory, the oratory that actually works, is pandering, right? Just if we use that cookery example as the word they use here in this translation, and you look at the fast food industry, that's more pandering. That's not so much the high cuisine making art form of really going to a high level restaurant and getting some really nice food. Just the very nice oratory of speaking very eloquently and fact-based and using evidence to base a persuasive argument against. That's an art form. That can be an art form and it's skillful, but oftentimes that's not what convinces people. What convinces people is a kind of pandering. And let me skip to page 31. Socrates says, oratory is a semblance of a branch of the art of politics. So he's saying this implies politics is about pandering. I just wrote that there. So his argument is it's kind of that's where politics kind of lies, right? And politicians, they kind of do that thing, right? They are more about that kind of oratory. And I would definitely argue that is the case if you look at politicians and how they talk and the way they talk to the public. A lot of it is just pandering to the public. Is it really based off of facts, or are they really basing their arguments off of evidence or truth? Their arguments might have that, but their focus is on, look, I gotta tug to the heartstrings of the people. Right? I gotta connect emotionally, right, with what their desires are. I gotta connect psychologically, right? And so the truth aspect of their persuasion is not focused on, because that might not necessarily be persuasive, right? And I think that's pretty important to realize. Politicians, they're just pandering to the public ultimately, and they use this kind of technique, oratory, which is what Socrates is saying, and it appears to be some sort of skill or some sort of technique or a high-level expert technical ability, but it's not that at all, right? It's just pandering, and it's not an actual skill, is what Socrates is arguing, because it doesn't focus on morality. But the way Socrates sees morality is not focused on truth. And then Socrates goes on. I skipped down some lines. And also such a thing as an unreal appearance of health. For example, many people appear to enjoy health in whom nobody but a doctor or trainer could detect the reverse. And I put in my little notes there, also spiritual health concerning ethics. So I say this, I bring this up because, yeah, Socrates is bringing up like, okay, you're convincing people by pandering to them, but is this good? Like, maybe instead of focusing on pandering, you should be focusing on like what's true and what's like actually like happening, rather than like this makeshift reality you're constructing to get people to follow you. Right? And that type of makeshift reality, that like, I guess they call it, a word people throw around a lot is parasocial. This kind of parasocial relationship that you're kind of fostering, which is not based off of truth. That's an unhealthy kind of relationship, right? But what's interesting is it seems like it's healthy. It seems like people are happy and they're enjoying themselves and they're having a good time and they're like, yeah, but is that really healthy? So, and he's saying like, well, sometimes certain kinds of health, a lay person is not going to see, or like there's this appearance that there's this healthy, like, that there's this positive relation that's happening, but the reality is that this is pretty bad. This is a kind of a toxic relationship, right? It's not healthy, right? And it's Socrates is saying like politicians, they kind of foster this kind of relationship between people, and it's not good. But on the surface, it seems very nice and very healthy and very like constructive, but it actually isn't. And you need like an expert or somebody who's knowledgeable will be able to detect that. But that's not very convincing. So it's really fascinating. And then I'll continue here. It's fascinating because it's very relevant to today, right? And it probably is always going to be relevant, throughout human history, because it kind of delves into the nature of human beings, right? Which is one of the great things about Plato's work, is that it kind of taps into these fundamental aspects about human nature that are just always around. No matter how much time passes, like these are some fundamental aspects of human nature, right? But Socrates continues here, I'm skipping. There is a condition of the soul as well as body, which gives the appearance of health without the reality. And that's what I'm talking about. Here's page 32. Socrates continues. I maintain that these two, body and soul, have two arts corresponding to them. That which deals with the soul I call the political art. So, and then when Socrates is talking about soul, he's talking about not just the metaphysical soul that we kind of refer to today as like this metaphysical relation, spiritual thing. He's also talking about like the mind too, like the intellect. Like he talks about when he refers to the soul, and when Plato brings up the soul, this is, ancient Greek philosophy, when they said soul, they also talked about the intellect and the mind as well as the soul. And so, and I bring this up because the point Socrates is saying is like pandering doesn't cater to the intellect at all. It just caters to the body, to base desires. And so that has little to do with the soul, which is very important. But here he says, like, he's skipping down, I skip down 3 lines. In the art of politics, what corresponds to training is called legislation, and what corresponds to medicine, the administration of justice. So here's the thing. Just like what we were saying with like cookery and like is a form of pandering, well, it depends, right? Like high level cuisine, that's an art form. But like fast food industry, McDonald's, Burger King, that's pandering to the masses, right? And that's not so much an art form, right? And it's the same way here. Like, there's good ways to be a politician where you're really focusing on the soul and you're actually focusing on, okay, how do we best distribute power in society, right? And that is a kind of, and so now you're looking for a truth, right? You're looking, which is a kind of morality, right? And so he's saying like true politics is an art, but he's also saying like politicians often don't do that. Rather, they dismiss the art of politics and they just go to pandering. They go to oratory, which is what he's saying. And I skip down 6 lines here. The pseudo art of the pander, being instinctively aware of this division of function, though it has no accurate knowledge, divides itself also into 4 branches, and putting on the guise of each of the genuine arts, pretends to be the art which it is impersonating, right? So that's what we're talking about here. It's like these politicians who adopt this kind of pandering pretend to be like to adopting the true art of politics, this focus on being truthful in organizing society, but that's not what they're doing. There's a pseudo art form is what Socrates is arguing. So it's trickery, right? It's trickery because the masses will see this politician, they're like, oh man, this person knows exactly what they're talking about, and you know, they're the real expert, but they're not. They're just pandering to your base desires. And then Socrates continues. Pandering pays no regard to the best interests of its object, but catches fools with the bait of an ephemeral pleasure and tricks them into holding it in the highest esteem. Skip down 6 lines. I call this sort of thing pandering, and I declare that it is dishonorable. I'm addressing you now, Polus, somebody else he's talking to in this dialogue, because it makes pleasure its aim instead of good. And I maintain that it is merely a knack and not an art, because it has no rational understanding of the nature of the various things it applies to, or the person to whom it applies, so that it can't explain anything. And here we are on page 33. This is the 4th line. Socrates is continuing his monologue. I say monologue because it's like really long discussion. He's talking to somebody, but it's becoming like this speech. He says, creates an illusion by the use of artificial adjuncts and makeup and depilatories and costume, and makes people assume a borrowed beauty to the neglect of the true beauty, which is the product of training. Socrates goes so far as to say, like, these are pseudo-politicians. We don't live, and one would argue, like, well, that's what politics is pandering. But Socrates and Plato, Plato, who wrote this dialogue, he believed in, like, true politics, right? He's like, politics are good, but, like, politicians oftentimes pretend to be like these politicians when they tricking the public when they're not actually doing it. They're just trying to get crowds of people to follow them. I will go to page 45 here. Again, this is Socrates talking. The fact is, my dear friend, that you are trying to prove me wrong by the use of oratory, like people in the law courts. They think there that they have got the better of the other party whenever they can produce many respectable witnesses to what they say, while their opponent can produce only one or none at all. But this kind of proof is useless in establishing the truth, for it can easily happen that a man is overborne by the false evidence of many apparently respectable persons. Right, and we see that in the criminal justice system all the time, at least here in the United States of America, but probably the world, where we kind of believe like, oh, this is an amazing system, this jury system, where like witnesses are brought up and people are are convinced by like eyewitness accounts and like evidence, but really it's false evidence, and like these eyewitness accounts are just pseudo experts. There's been a lot of like academic research done about how witnesses are not the most reliable forms of evidence, and then you have like people who are respectable who come on and give their arguments, and like where is that respect based off of? And you know, you got lots of innocent people get thrown in prison and all of this kind of stuff. And that's what Socrates is talking about, like oratory. We think it's like this well-established form of making conclusions, but really it's just pandering, right? Which is not a moral way to make decisions. I'm skipping down 9 lines now. It's still Socrates talking. But I, though I am but a single individual, do not agree with you, for you produce no compelling reason why I should. Instead, you call numerous false witnesses against me in your attempt to evict me from my lawful property. The truth. I believe that nothing worth speaking of will have been accomplished in our discussion unless I can obtain your agreement, and yours alone, as a witness to the truth of what I say. And the same holds good for you, in my opinion, unless you can get just me only on your side, and you can disregard what the rest of the world may say. And that's pretty interesting and important to think about. He's saying like, because Socrates is saying like, look, man, this whole like way that we argue with people where it's like, well, my argument is right because look how many people are following me. Like, look how many people agree with me. This kind of influencer culture where it's like, we shouldn't base our opinions off of that. Rather, we should base our opinions off of truth. That shouldn't be like the way we convince people or like try to get people to see our point of view. You make an idea like, I believe in this, and the reason why I believe in this because this person over there believes in it, and this person over there believes in it, and this person in there believes in it. It's like, yeah, but what about the person you're talking to? Like, why is it that they don't believe in what you're, or like, why are they not convinced by your argument? Like, just focus on them, and maybe you won't get to convince them of your argument, but at least instead of focusing on like trying to get as many people as possible on your side, you should be like, okay, what is it that you disagree with? Okay, so these are the points that you disagree with. Okay, well, let me try and form some sort of relation. Let me try and like get at the heart of your conflict. Maybe you feel this way because you think because of a very difference of religion, or some community grew up had different ideas about certain things, or you have cultural differences, and okay, I can respect that, but here's why I don't agree with that. And instead of like saying like, well, all these people over here believe it, it's like, well, no, I'm focusing on you, right? And Socrates is like saying that's what matters. Whether we talk about philosophy and we talk about the exchange of ideas, we need to focus on each other rather than trying to get other people to just buy into what we're saying. I'll continue here. There are then these two sorts of proof, the kind on which you and many other people rely, and the kind which I on my side think reliable. Let us compare them and see how they differ. For the subject of our argument, so far from being trivial, is perhaps that on which knowledge is finest and ignorance most shameful. It is, in brief, knowledge or ignorance of who is happy and who is not. Right? So, and then I put in my notes here, the importance of dialectics. What do you think, rather than what everyone else says? Right? That's a simple question. Like, instead of saying like, well, what do you think? What do you think? Rather than like, well, this is what everybody else says. So it kind of doesn't matter what you think. It's like everybody else is saying this. It's like, well, no. And that's just like, but we live in a world where it's more about like, this is what everybody else thinks. And so therefore you need to get with the program rather than like, okay, you think this way. Why? And I'm just focusing on you. Like, why do you think that way? Okay. You think that way because this. Okay, well, I disagree because I think this, and this. And let's reason this out. Yeah, but everybody else is saying it. Like, let's not worry about what everybody else is saying. Right? We're having a conversation between, and then maybe other people will come in and go, okay, what do you have to say? Okay, what do you have to say? Rather than like this influencer culture is like, well, I have 50,000 subscribers, therefore, my opinion holds a lot of weight, or whatever. Like 80 million people voted for me, so therefore, that means I'm right. It's like, no, that doesn't mean you're right at all, right? We need to have more dialogue, more discussion, more mutual communication. And then to continue my notes, using your mind to come up with conclusions based in rationality by getting your opinions challenged rather than relying on groupthink, basically, is what I wrote. So yeah, I think this is an excellent work. I mean, it's not all, some things that are brought up in here are not all, I agree with. And, there's a lot of contradictions here that Socrates brings up himself, and you're like, well, that's, I don't know about that. I mean, you're kind of contradicting yourself there, Socrates. And, but, I like to just focus on like, well, what are the good things that are brought up? And there's some really great things brought up in this dialogue here by Plato. that are highly relevant to today, and I would encourage you to check it out. This is Plato's Gorgias. Well, you've been watching the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.